The diamond on the diner table had cost more than my life, but I only had 10 seconds to decide if I'd rather take the ring or the bullet meant for the man who broke me. The overhead light of the 24-hour diner flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the velvet box sitting between the salt shaker and the ketchup. Inside, a rock the size of a sparrow's egg mocked me. "Diane." Attilio's voice was a low growl, a stark contrast to the frantic hum of the industrial refrigerator behind us. He leaned forward, his tailored suit worth more than the entire building, his hands raised in a gesture that was half plea, half command. "Take it. It's yours. Everything I own is yours." My hands stayed locked in my lap, my knuckles white against my stained apron. Just 3 nights ago, those same hands had been pinned against the cold silk of his sheets in the VIP lounge. He had taken what he wanted, fueled by the dark entitlement of a man who had never been told no. But then he'd seen the blood. He'd seen the truth of my innocence, a purity he thought didn't exist in his world. Now, the predator was kneeling in a grease-stained booth. He didn't want my body anymore. He wanted my silence, my forgiveness, my soul. 10 seconds, Diane," he whispered, his eyes scanning the windows as a black sedan slowed down outside. "Pick up the ring, or we both die in this booth." The air in the Sapphire Lounge always smelled of expensive tobacco and desperation. It was a thick, cloying scent that stuck to the polyester of my Waitress uniform, a constant reminder that I didn't belong among the velvet curtains and gold-leafed ceilings. To the men who sat in the shadows, I was part of the furniture, a moving tray of crystal tumblers and top-shelf bourbon. "One more round for table 4, Diane," the floor manager hissed, his eyes darting toward the private alcoves. "And move faster. The heavy hitters are in tonight." I nodded, my fingers stiffly gripping the edge of my cork-lined tray. I was tired. Not just the kind of tired that a night's sleep could fix, but a bone-deep exhaustion that came from balancing 3 jobs and a mounting stack of medical bills that never seemed to shrink. My normalcy was a cycle of grease, tips, and the quiet fear of the next rent check bouncing. I moved through the dim light of the VIP lounge, my sneakers silent on the plush carpet. The music was a low, thrumming bass that felt like a heartbeat. At the center of it all sat the Padovano table. Even from a distance, Attilio was an apex predator in a room full of scavengers. He didn't lean back like the others. He sat forward, his presence taking up more space than his physical frame. His suit was a dark midnight navy that seemed to absorb the ambient light, and his hands, large, scarred and powerful, were wrapped around a glass of neat scotch. I felt his gaze before I saw it. It wasn't the usual leering look I got from the drunk businessmen at the bar. This was different. It was heavy, weighted with a dark, sudden interest that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Your drink, sir," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the jazz. As I reached out to set the glass down, my hand trembled, just a fraction of an inch, and a single drop of amber liquid splashed onto the mahogany table. My heart plummeted. In a place like this, a drop of scotch was a cardinal sin. I'm so sorry," I stammered, reaching for the cloth tucked into my waistband. Before I could wipe it away, a hand clamped around my wrist. His skin was scorching, his grip like a steel cuff. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat as I looked up. Attilio Padovano wasn't looking at the spilled drink. He was looking at me, his dark eyes tracing the line of my jaw, the teary exhaustion in my eyes, and the way my pulse thrummed frantically against his thumb. The air in the lounge suddenly felt thin, as if he were inhaling all the oxygen in the room. His men went silent, the laughter at the neighboring tables fading into a muffled hum. "You're new," he said, his voice a low melodic rasp that sent a shiver of pure, unadulterated dread down my spine. "I've been here 6 months, sir," I managed to say, trying to pull back, but his grip didn't budge. He wasn't hurting me, not yet, but the sheer dominance in his touch was enough to make my knees weak. 6 months, he repeated, a slow, dangerous smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And I'm only seeing you now. That's a waste of a beautiful thing." He let go of my wrist, but the mark of his heat remained. I didn't stay to hear the rest. I turned and retreated into the safety of the kitchen, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I would go home, count my singles, and wake up to the same gray life tomorrow. I didn't realize that the normal part of my life had just ended the moment his thumb touched my pulse. Attilio Padovano didn't just notice things. He took them. And tonight, he had decided that I was the only thing in the room worth owning. I was pushed inside, my tray gone, my dignity already fraying at the seams. Attilio stood by the window, his back to me, looking out over the city as if he owned every flickering light in the skyline. The door clicked shut behind me, a heavy, final sound that made my breath hitch. "I didn't give you permission to leave the table, Deanne," he said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. I had other tables, sir. My shift. Your shift ended the moment I looked at you." He turned slowly, shedding his suit jacket like a predator shedding its skin. He moved with a terrifying fluid grace, closing the distance until I was backed against the cold wood of the door. The air smelled of sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of power. I was a waitress who lived on tips and tap water. He was a man who broke empires for sport. When his hands found my waist, they weren't seeking permission. They were claiming territory. The struggle was short, a desperate flutter of my hands against his chest that he stifled with the sheer weight of his body. He was fueled by a dark, cynical entitlement, convinced that every woman in this club had a price, and he had already paid it in his mind. The world narrowed to the suffocating heat of the red silk sheets and the jagged sound of my own sobbing breath. He took what he wanted with a ruthless, efficient hunger. His eyes closed as if he were merely consuming a vintage wine. But then the atmosphere shifted. The silence that followed was louder than the act itself. Attilio pulled back, his breath heavy, his hand sliding across the silk to steady himself. That's when he saw it. The dark, unmistakable bloom of crimson on the white undersheet. A stark, visceral testimony to a truth he hadn't considered possible. He froze. The dominant, forceful curve of his shoulders vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid shock. He looked at the bed, then at me, curled into a trembling ball, my face buried in my hands, my body racking with silent, broken shudders. In the cynical world of the Padovano family, purity was a myth, a fairy tale told to children. To him, everyone was used, everyone was bought, and everyone was dirty. To find a girl who had guarded herself in the middle of this den of vice was like finding a diamond in a gutter. "Deanne." His voice was different now. The predator was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had just accidentally stepped on a holy relic. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from my shoulder, trembling for the first time in his life. I flinched away, a choked gasp escaping my throat. The sight of my terror seemed to physically wound him. Attilio stood up abruptly, stumbling back as if the room were tilting. His face, usually a mask of stone-cold command, was a portrait of horrified realization. He hadn't just taken a woman. He had destroyed something irreplaceable. He had committed a sin that his own twisted code of honor couldn't reconcile. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. He simply backed away into the shadows of the red room. His eyes fixed on me with a haunting, obsessive guilt that told me one thing. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a nightmare I couldn't escape. The sun rose the next morning with a cruel, indifferent brightness that felt like an insult. Deanne moved through her cramped studio apartment like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. Every muscle ached with a deep, pulsing trauma, and the shower had done nothing to scrub away the phantom weight of Attilio's hands. She dressed in a high-neck sweater despite the humidity, her fingers fumbling with the buttons as she prepared to submerge herself back into the only safety she knew, the grind of survival. She needed to work. She needed to forget the look on his face when he saw the blood, the way his monstrous confidence had shattered into something that looked terrifyingly like remorse. Her first stop was the landlord's office, a small, tobacco-stained room at the end of the hall. She had 3 crumpled $20 bills in her pocket, a pathetic down payment on the 2 months of rent she owed. She braced herself for the usual lecture, her rehearsed apologies sitting bitter on her tongue. "I'm here about the late fees, Mr. Henderson," she began, not looking up from the floor. "Late fees." The old man let out a short, confused bark of a laugh. He pulled a ledger from the desk and spun it toward her. "The hell are you talking about, Royer? A man in a suit came by at 6 this morning. Handed me a cashier's check that looked like it belonged in a museum." Deanne's heart skipped a beat. She leaned over the desk, her eyes scanning the ink. "He didn't just pay the arrears," Henderson continued, his voice dropping to a suspicious whisper. "He paid for the next 10 years. Front. Told me if I ever bothered you about a repair or a bill again, I'd be looking for a new line of work, from a wheelchair." The blood drained from Deanne's face. 10 years. It wasn't a gift. It was a brand. It was Attilio's way of ensuring she was tethered to a place where he could always find her. She backed out of the office without a word, the air in the hallway suddenly feeling as thin as it had in the Red Room. When she stepped out onto the sidewalk to head to the diner for her morning shift, the reality of her new life solidified. Parked directly across from the building's entrance was a black SUV with windows so dark they looked like polished obsidian. It didn't move. The engine didn't even seem to be running, but she could feel the heat of attention radiating from behind the glass. She began to walk, her pace quickening. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, the vehicle was there, gliding 20 yards behind her with the silent, predatory patience of a shark in shallow water. It followed her through the narrow alleys and across the main intersections, a looming shadow that announced to the world that she was no longer an invisible waitress. She was property. By the time she reached the diner, she was trembling so hard she could barely push the door open. The bell chimed, a cheerful domestic sound that felt like a scream. She rushed to the back, hoping to lose herself in the steam of the dishwasher and the smell of burnt coffee, but as she looked through the pass-through window to the street, the black SUV pulled into a spot directly in front of her window. The driver didn't get out. No one approached her. It was worse than an attack. It was a vigil. Attilio wasn't just paying her debts. He was surrounding her with his presence, turning her world into a gilded cage where the bars were made of tinted glass and blood money checks. The normalcy she had fought so hard to maintain was being methodically dismantled, replaced by the suffocating, silent protection of the man who had stolen her peace. The sun rose the next morning with a cruel, indifferent brightness that felt like an insult. Deanne moved through her cramped studio apartment like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. Every muscle ached with a deep, pulsing trauma, and the shower had done nothing to scrub away the phantom weight of Attilio's hands. She dressed in a high-neck sweater despite the humidity, her fingers fumbling with the buttons as she prepared to submerge herself back into the only safety she knew, the grind of survival. She needed to work. She needed to forget the look on his face when he saw the blood, the way his monstrous confidence had shattered into something that looked terrifyingly like remorse. Her first stop was the landlord's office, a small, tobacco-stained room at the end of the hall. She had 3 crumpled $20 bills in her pocket, a pathetic down payment on the 2 months of rent she owed. She braced herself for the usual lecture, her rehearsed apologies sitting bitter on her tongue. "I'm here about the late fees, Mr. Henderson," she began, not looking up from the floor. "Late fees." The old man let out a short, confused bark of a laugh. He pulled a ledger from the desk and spun it toward her. "The hell are you talking about, Royer? A man in a suit came by at 6 this morning. Handed me a cashier's check that looked like it belonged in a museum." Deanne's heart skipped a beat. She leaned over the desk, her eyes scanning the ink. "He didn't just pay the arrears," Henderson continued, his voice dropping to a suspicious whisper. "He paid for the next 10 years. Front. Told me if I ever bothered you about a repair or a bill again, I'd be looking for a new line of work, from a wheelchair." The blood drained from Deanne's face. 10 years. It wasn't a gift. It was a brand. It was Attilio's way of ensuring she was tethered to a place where he could always find her. She backed out of the office without a word, the air in the hallway suddenly feeling as thin as it had in the Red Room. When she stepped out onto the sidewalk to head to the diner for her morning shift, the reality of her new life solidified. Parked directly across from the building's entrance was a black SUV with windows so dark they looked like polished obsidian. It didn't move. The engine didn't even seem to be running, but she could feel the heat of attention radiating from behind the glass. She began to walk, her pace quickening. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, the vehicle was there, gliding 20 yards behind her with the silent, predatory patience of a shark in shallow water. It followed her through the narrow alleys and across the main intersections, a looming shadow that announced to the world that she was no longer an invisible waitress. She was property. By the time she reached the diner, she was trembling so hard she could barely push the door open. The bell chimed, a cheerful domestic sound that felt like a scream. She rushed to the back, hoping to lose herself in the steam of the dishwasher and the smell of burnt coffee, but as she looked through the pass-through window to the street, the black SUV pulled into a spot directly in front of her window. The driver didn't get out. No one approached her. It was worse than an attack. It was a vigil. Attilio wasn't just paying her debts. He was surrounding her with his presence, turning her world into a gilded cage where the bars were made of tinted glass and blood money checks. The normalcy she had fought so hard to maintain was being methodically dismantled, replaced by the suffocating, silent protection of the man who had stolen her peace. The diamond on Deanne's finger felt like a lead weight, a cold fire that seemed to burn through her skin as she walked toward her apartment. She hadn't put it on because she wanted to be a queen. She had put it on because Attilio's eyes had held a terrifying, prophetic certainty. But as she reached the top of the stairwell, the heavy silence of the hallway told her that the protection of a monster was a double-edged sword. Her front door was ajar. The wood around the lock was splintered, white jagged teeth of timber bared in the dim light. "Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. She pushed the door open. The small studio, usually filled with the scent of her brother's art supplies and the low hum of the radio, was a wreckage. A chair was overturned. A stack of Leo's sketches had been trampled into the floor, marked by the heavy, rhythmic tread of muddy boots. But it was the kitchen table that stopped her breath. Resting in the center of the table, exactly where Attilio's ring box had been in her mind, was Leo's inhaler. It sat atop a single, thick card embossed with a crest that wasn't the Padovano wolf. It was the Visconti viper. Deanne didn't have time to scream before the black SUV she had come to fear screeched to a halt in the street below. She ran to the window, her heart a frantic percussion against her ribs. She expected to see the shadows of gunmen, but instead, the door opened and Attilio himself stepped out. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. He moved with the grim, focused stride of a man who already knew the air had turned to poison. He was in her apartment seconds later, his presence turning the small room into a claustrophobic cage. He didn't look at the mess. He looked at the card on the table. "They took him," Deanne choked out, clutching the inhaler to her chest as if it were her brother's soul. "Leo, he's only 19, Attilio. He has nothing to do with this. He's just a kid who draws." Attilio's face was a mask of cold, architectural fury. The unthinkable act of claiming her had sent a ripple through the underworld, and his rivals had moved with surgical cruelty. They had found the one thread of her life that wasn't covered by his silk sheets and velvet promises. "They didn't take him because of who he is," Attilio said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "They took him because of who you are to me. They want to see if the dawn will bleed for a waitress." He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to grip her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her since the diner, and his touch was no longer predatory. It was possessive, a declaration of war. "They think they've found my jugular, Deanne. They think that by hurting him they can break me." "Can they?" she asked, her eyes searching his for a flicker of the man who had looked horrified in the red room. Attilio's grip tightened, his thumb brushing against the collar of her sweater. "They made a mistake. They think you are my weakness. They haven't realized yet that you are the only reason I'm still holding back the monster they should be truly afraid of." He pulled a phone from his pocket, barking a single name into the line. The air in the room felt thick with the sudden metallic scent of impending violence. Deanne looked down at the diamond on her hand, the light catching its facets. It wasn't a piece of jewelry anymore. It was a debt written in blood, and her brother was the one being forced to pay the interest. The Padovano estate was not a home. It was a fortress of limestone and cold intent. As the iron gates groaned shut behind the SUV, Deanne felt the final thread of her old life snap. She was no longer a woman with a name. She was a variable in a war she didn't understand, moved like a chess piece into a palace of echoing marble and silent, watchful men. Attilio didn't lead her through the grand foyer. He bypassed the sweeping staircases and gold-leafed ceilings, taking her instead to a private wing where the air felt pressurized, heavy with the scent of cedar and old secrets. "You stay here," Attilio commanded, his voice a low vibration in the hallway. "My men are at every exit. The Visconti won't reach you, and my people won't touch you. Not if they want to keep their hands." He opened a set of heavy oak doors and stepped aside. Deanne walked into the room, expecting the same sterile luxury of the rest of the mansion. Instead, she found a room that felt like a sanctuary, and a tomb. It was a replica of a life she'd never had, filled with soft textures and warm light, but the windows were reinforced with steel mesh that looked like lace until you touched the cold metal. She wandered through the suite, her heels clicking rhythmically on the polished floor, until she reached the inner dressing room. A heavy antique chest sat beneath a portrait of a woman who shared Attilio's dark, brooding eyes. The lid was slightly ajar, as if someone had been disturbed while looking inside. Driven by a morbid curiosity she couldn't suppress, Deanne lifted the lid. The air left her lungs in a jagged gasp. Inside the chest, folded with a precision that bordered on the religious, were the white silk sheets from the Red Room. They weren't laundered. The stark, rust-colored stains of her stolen innocence were still there, preserved like a relic of a martyr. Beside the fabric lay her silver cross, the cheap, thin chain she thought she'd lost forever. It had been cleaned, the silver polished until it shone with a blinding, accusatory light. A shadow fell over her, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She didn't have to turn around to know Attilio was standing in the doorway. "Why?" she whispered, her hand hovering over the blood-stained silk. "Why would you keep this? To remind yourself of what you can take. To gloat. To remember what I can never fix," he said. His voice was right behind her ear, thick and raw. He didn't move to touch her, but his presence was a physical weight. "In my world we keep trophies of our victories. But I keep that to remind me of the only time I truly lost. I looked at those sheets for 48 hours, Deanne. I watched the blood dry and realized that for the first time in my life, I had destroyed something I actually wanted to keep." Deanne turned, her back hitting the chest, her eyes searching his. He looked older in the dim light, the lines of his face etched with a haunting, obsessive guilt. He wasn't looking at her as a conquest anymore. He was looking at her as a penance. "This is my cage, isn't it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The rent, the ring, the guards. They aren't for my safety. They're so you can keep your sin close enough to watch it." "It's both," Attilio admitted, his gaze dropping to the diamond on her finger. "You are the only thing in this world that isn't stained, Deanne. And I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone else touch you." The realization was more terrifying than his initial cruelty. He didn't just want her. He was sanctifying his own guilt through her. She was a prisoner in a golden cage, guarded by the very monster who had provided the bars. The velvet cage was no longer enough. The news from the streets was a discordant symphony of rising threats. The Visconti were not just coming for Attilio, they were hunting the girl who had turned the wolf into a man with a conscience. Attilio knew the limits of his men and the fallibility of stone walls. He knew that eventually, there would be a door his guards couldn't reach in time. He led Deanne down to the basement levels of the estate, far below the marble floors and the preserved silk sheets. This room was stripped of luxury. It was all concrete, industrial lighting, and the sharp antiseptic smell of gun oil. On a central table sat a single object that caught the fluorescent light. A slim, obsidian-handled stiletto. "The Visconti don't want a ransom, Diane," Attilio said. His voice flat and clinical as he picked up the blade. "They want a message. If they get close to you, they won't use a gun. They'll want to feel your life leave you." Diane recoiled, her back hitting a cold concrete pillar. "I can't. I don't want to know how to do this." "You don't have the luxury of choice," he snapped, moving into her space with that terrifying sudden speed. He grabbed her hand, the one wearing the blood-red diamond, and forced her fingers around the hilt. "If I am not there, you are the only one who can save you. Now stand like you mean to survive." He stepped behind her, his chest a wall of heat against her back. It was a mirroring of the night in the Red Room, but the intent had shifted from consumption to survival. He reached around, his large, scarred hands covering hers, guiding the blade into a defensive posture. The intimacy was suffocating. She could feel the steady, heavy thrum of his heart against her shoulder blades, a reminder of the power that had once overwhelmed her. "Hold it tight," he murmured into her ear, his breath ghosting over the skin he had once marked. "If you're soft, they'll take it from you and use it. You have to be harder than the steel." He moved her through the motions, the parry, the thrust, the quick, jagged slice aimed at the softest parts of a man. Every time she flinched, he tightened his grip, his body pressing firmer against hers. It was a different kind of violation, one that stripped away her last pretenses of being an outsider to his world. He was molding her into a weapon, staining her hands with the knowledge of how to kill before she had even learned how to live again. At one point, he spun her around, his hand moving to the back of her neck to hold her steady. The knife was between them, the tip resting just above his own heart. "Look at me," he commanded. Diane looked up, her eyes bright with tears and a burgeoning, jagged spark of rage. "Is this what you wanted? To make me like you?" "I wanted you to stay pure," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that hurt more than his grip. "But the world is too hungry for that. I am teaching you how to stay alive so that I don't have to bury you next to those sheets." In the silence of the concrete room, the air grew thick with a desperate, painful tension. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. It wasn't a kiss. It was a collision of two broken things. For a fleeting second, the dawn was gone, and there was only a man drowning in a debt he could never pay, and the woman who was beginning to realize that the only way to survive the monster was to let him teach her how to bite back. The chandelier-drenched ballroom of the Palazzo Valenti was a sea of shimmering silk and sharpened knives disguised as smiles. This was the unveiling, the moment Attilio would present his unthinkable choice to the High Council of the Underworld. Diane felt like a sacrificial lamb draped in midnight blue velvet, the weight of the Padovano diamond on her finger feeling less like jewelry and more like a bullseye. "Keep your chin up," Attilio murmured, his hand a heavy, possessive brand on the small of her back. "You are the future queen of this city. Don't look at them like they are wolves. Look at them like they are glass." But Diane couldn't help it. Every eye in the room, from the scarred capos to their ice-cold wives, was a predatory flicker. She was the waitress, the stain on the Padovano lineage, the girl who had turned the most ruthless man in Italy into a romantic fool. As they moved toward the head table, a woman detached herself from a group of socialites near the fountain. Bianca Moretti, the daughter of a powerful underboss who had been tipped to marry Attilio for years, approached with a smile that didn't reach her predatory pale eyes. She held 2 flutes of vintage champagne, the bubbles dancing with a deceptive golden light. "A toast," Bianca said, her voice a melodic venom, "to the woman who did what none of us could, who caught the eye of the wolf." Attilio's eyes narrowed, his instincts flickering, but the rules of the gala were ancient and rigid. To refuse a toast in front of the commission was an act of open war. He took a glass and Diane, her throat dry with a terror she couldn't swallow, took the other. "To the future," Bianca whispered, her eyes locked on Diane's with a strange, expectant intensity. Diane took a sip. The champagne was crisp, tasting of green apples and a faint metallic aftertaste that she attributed to the nerves sparking in her chest. She watched Bianca move away into the crowd, her silhouette disappearing behind a pillar. It started as a dull throb behind her eyes. Within minutes, the grand ballroom began to tilt. The music of the string quartet stretched and distorted, the violins sounding like the screams of dying birds. Diane's hand flew to her throat, her breath suddenly catching in a windpipe that felt like it was narrowing to a needle's eye. "Attilio," she gasped, her legs turning to water. He caught her before she hit the marble, his armchair-sized chest the only thing keeping her upright. "Diane, look at me." She tried, but his face was a blur of obsidian and panic. Her skin felt like it was being pricked by 1,000 heated pins. Across the room, she saw Bianca standing by the shadows, a glass of dark red wine in her hand, her expression one of cold, satisfied triumph. The room erupted into a cacophony of shouting. Attilio's men drew their weapons, forming a wall of black suits around the fallen girl. The waitress was dying in the Don's arms, and as the darkness began to pull at the edges of her vision, Diane felt Attilio's roar of grief and rage vibrate through her very bones. He hadn't just brought her to a gala. He had brought her to an altar of sacrifice. "Don't close your eyes," Attilio choked out, his voice a fractured, terrifying sound. "Diane, stay with me. I will kill them all, I swear it, just stay." But the poison was a patient thief. As the lights of the palazzo faded into a singular haunting point of white, Diane realized that the knives in this world didn't always come from the front. The world returned to Diane in agonizing, jagged pulses of light and the smell of ozone and gunpowder. She was no longer in the palace of marble. She was in the belly of a concrete warehouse, the air thick with the humidity of the docks and the low, guttural snarl of men pushed to the edge of sanity. She lay on a metal table, her lungs burning with every shallow breath, but the paralyzing fog of the poison was receding, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. Attilio stood a few feet away, his tuxedo jacket gone, his white shirt splattered with a map of crimson that wasn't his own. He looked less like a man and more like a force of nature that had leveled everything in its path. He had spent the last 6 hours turning the city into a pyre, tearing through the Moretti ranks until the antidote was forced from a trembling doctor's hand. But the cure wasn't the end of the debt. In the center of the room, bound to a chair under a single flickering bulb, was Bianca Moretti. Her face was a mask of ruined pride, her evening gown torn and stained with the soot of the fires Attilio had lit to find her. Attilio's men stood in the shadows, their faces grim, waiting for the final act of a play that had begun in a diner. "She is awake," Attilio said, his voice a dead, hollow sound that made the hair on Diane's neck rise. He turned to her, his eyes dark with a terrifying expectation. Diane sat up, her limbs heavy, the stiletto he had trained her to use resting on the table beside her. The obsidian handle was cold, a silent invitation to finish what the world had started. "The commission is watching, Diane," Attilio murmured, stepping toward her. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He offered the knife. "They saw you fall. They saw my weakness bleed on the floor. If you walk out of here as just the girl who survived, they will come for you every night until they succeed. To be my queen, you cannot just be a victim who was saved. You have to be the one who ends the threat." Diane looked at Bianca, who spat a mouthful of blood toward them, her eyes still burning with a desperate, jealous hate. "She's a waitress, Attilio," Bianca hissed. "She doesn't have the stomach for our world. Go ahead, little lamb. Prove me right. Tremble." Diane's fingers closed around the hilt of the stiletto. The weight felt different now, not like a burden but like an anchor. She remembered the red room, the black SUV, and the way her brother's inhaler had looked on the kitchen table. She realized then that Attilio hadn't just saved her life. He had destroyed her ability to live in the light. She stood, her legs shaking but her gaze fixed. She walked toward Bianca, the silence of the warehouse stretching until it felt like it would snap. "I was a waitress," Diane said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal calm that mirrored Attilio's own. I was a girl who took tips and stayed invisible. But you didn't just try to kill me. You tried to take the only thing I had left. She leaned in, the tip of the obsidian blade resting against the hollow of Bianca's throat. Attilio watched from the shadows, his heart hammering with a dark, twisted pride. This was the unthinkable choice. To stay pure and die, or to stain her soul and rule. The strike was swift, a practiced shadow of the training in the basement. As Bianca slumped forward, the debt was settled in a spray of scarlet. Diane didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply turned to Attilio, the knife still in her hand, and saw the man who had broken her finally kneeling in her shadow. The silence that followed the finality of the warehouse was unlike any other. It wasn't the suffocating quiet of the Red Room or the panicked stillness of the diner. It was the heavy, absolute silence of a graveyard where Diane's old self had been laid to rest. She stood over the obsidian blade, her reflection caught in the pooling crimson on the concrete, and realized the girl who worried about rent and the morning shift had bled out alongside her enemy. Attilio approached her with a reverence that felt like a weight. He didn't reach for the knife, and he didn't try to pull her into a triumphant embrace. He moved with a slow, deliberate caution, as if he were finally realizing that the weapon he had forged had a sharper edge than he could control. He reached into his pocket and produced the ring one last time. It didn't look like a promise of love in the harsh, flickering industrial light. It looked like a crown of thorns and ice. He sank to one knee, a gesture that would have sent shockwaves through the commission had they been there to see the most feared man in the city bow to a woman without a drop of noble blood in her veins. "The threat is gone," he whispered, his voice a fractured rasp of devotion and exhaustion. "The seat at my side is yours. Not as a guest, not as a witness, but as the woman whose name will be the last word spoken by anyone who dares to look at us." Diane looked down at him. She saw the blood on his white shirt, the obsessive tilt of his head, and the terrifying depth of a guilt that had transformed into a singular dark worship. She reached out, her fingers still trembling slightly as she took the ring from the box. She didn't wait for him to slide it on. She pushed it onto her own finger, the diamond flaring with a cold, predatory light that matched her eyes. "The waitress died in that gala, Attilio," she said, her voice steady and chillingly calm. "She was a soft thing, and you knew that when you took her. You broke her world so you could rebuild it in your image." She reached down, her hand cupping his jaw, forcing him to look up at the woman he had created. Her touch was no longer the flinch of a victim. It was the claim of a sovereign. "You think this ring settles the debt? You think providing a fortress and a few dead enemies pays for what you stole in the Red Room?" She leaned in, her breath ghosting over his lips. "You didn't win me, Attilio. You didn't seduce me, and you didn't earn me. You ruined me so thoroughly that I have nowhere else to go but your throne." Attilio's breath hitched, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of the girl she used to be. But he found only the hard, polished surface of a survivor. "From this moment on," Diane continued, her voice echoing in the hollow warehouse, "you owe me a lifetime of service. You will be my sword when I want to strike, and my shield when I want to hide. You will spend every waking breath trying to earn a forgiveness that I may never give. You wanted a queen, Attilio. Now you have one." Attilio didn't argue. He leaned his forehead against her hand, a gesture of total, terrifying submission. "My life is yours," he vowed into the silence. Diane turned toward the warehouse doors, the black SUVs waiting in the rain to carry them back to the estate. She didn't look back at the wreckage. She walked out into the night, the consort of the Padovano Empire, knowing that while he might rule the city, she was the only one who ruled the monster.